On the morning of January 16, 1942, a single U.S. Navy torpedo bomber rose into the pale sky above the Pacific Ocean. At the controls sat Harold Dixon, a veteran enlisted pilot who had spent most of his adult life in naval aviation. He was calm, methodical, and deeply familiar with the aircraft beneath him. This was not his first patrol, and nothing about the mission briefing suggested that it would be different from dozens he had already flown. The Douglas Devastator was not a fast machine. By early 1942, it was already showing its age, but it had one quality that mattered above all others: reliability. Dixon trusted the aircraft, and the two men flying with him trusted Dixon. In the rear cockpit, radio man Gene Aldrich monitored the radio equipment that would guide them home. Forward in the aircraft, ordnance man Tony Pastula watched the ocean below through the bombardier's window, scanning for any sign of enemy activity. Their orders were clear and precise. Fly far ahead of the carrier group. Search for hostile submarines. Maintain radio silence to protect the fleet's position. Return within 3 hours. It was a routine assignment in an ocean that had already become a battlefield. By mid-January, the Pacific was no longer empty. Japanese patrols operated far beyond their home waters, and American carriers were constantly changing position to avoid detection. Navigation depended on discipline, calculation, and the assumption that conditions would behave as expected. An hour into the flight, that assumption began to collapse. Dixon felt it before he fully understood it. The aircraft no longer tracked cleanly. A subtle shift in the wind nudged the bomber off its intended course. He corrected, then corrected again. But the resistance felt wrong. The ocean below offered no landmarks, no reference points, only an unbroken surface of water stretching in every direction. Aldrich attempted to contact the carrier. The response was nothing but static. He adjusted the frequency. Still nothing. Either the carrier had moved farther than anticipated, or the aircraft had drifted much farther than Dixon realized. Fuel consumption became a constant calculation. The gauge crept downward with quiet indifference, each tick erasing margin they could not afford to lose. Dixon did the math in his head, again and again, hoping the numbers would change. They did not. Pastula thought he saw something on the horizon. Dixon banked the aircraft and looked. There was nothing. No ship, no land, no sign of human presence. Just the Pacific, endless and uniform. By early afternoon, the truth was impossible to ignore. The carrier was not where it should have been. The radio was useless, and the fuel remaining was no longer enough to keep searching. Dixon faced the reality every pilot dreads. The flight had gone too far, and there might be no way back. By early afternoon, the Pacific had stripped away all illusions. There was no carrier on the horizon, no friendly ships cutting white lines across the water, and no reassuring crackle from the radio. The silence was complete. Harold Dixon checked the fuel gauge again, hoping for a mistake. There was none. What remained was not enough to keep flying in circles. He made the hardest calculation of the day. Continuing the search meant certain failure. Turning back immediately offered a chance, small, shrinking, but real. Dixon rolled the aircraft and set a course toward where the carrier should have been, leaning the fuel mixture and adjusting altitude to stretch every possible minute of flight. Inside the cockpit, no one spoke. Each man understood what was at stake. The bomber droned on, steady and indifferent, while the ocean below remained unchanged. No markers, no mercy. Minutes passed, then more. The fuel needle dropped past the point Dixon had been watching. Pastula scanned the horizon until his eyes ached. Aldrich tried the radio again, then again, carefully adjusting settings, listening for anything that sounded like life. Static answered every attempt. The sun climbed higher. Heat filled the cockpit. Sweat ran down their faces, evaporating almost as fast as it formed. Dixon's hand stayed locked on the controls, his expression unreadable. Years of training kept panic at bay, but even discipline could not change physics. Then the engine coughed. It was subtle at first, a hesitation more felt than heard. Dixon recognized it instantly. He had flown long enough to know that sound. Fuel starvation was beginning. He checked the gauge. What remained could be measured in minutes now, not miles. There was no land, no ships, no help coming. Dixon gave the order calmly, his voice steady, despite the reality behind it. Prepare to ditch. Aldrich began pulling loose gear toward the center of the aircraft. Pastula gathered what little survival equipment they could carry. There was no checklist for this moment, only instinct and experience. The nearest land lay hundreds of miles away. The ocean beneath them was thousands of feet deep. If the aircraft broke apart on impact, they would not escape it. If it flipped, they would be trapped inside. A successful water landing was their only chance. Dixon began a controlled descent, easing the bomber downward, while the engine sputtered again. The Pacific rose toward them, no longer an abstract surface but a moving wall of dark blue. From altitude, the water had looked calm. Up close, it revealed rolling swells that lifted and fell like breathing giants. At 200 feet, Dixon leveled out. At 100, he adjusted again. He studied the pattern of the waves, searching for the narrow window between swells where impact might be survivable. The engine coughed one final time. Dixon cut power himself. For a brief moment, the aircraft glided in silence. Then, the belly of the bomber struck the ocean. Metal screamed. The force threw the crew forward as the aircraft skipped once, then twice, before settling hard into the water. Dixon felt the controls tear from his hands. They were down. The bomber floated, barely. Water rushed in through seams and panels. Dixon unbuckled and stood, shouting orders as the aircraft began to sink beneath their feet. The Pacific had accepted them, and it was already pulling them under. The aircraft did not give them much time. For a few heartbeats, it floated, as if reconsidering its fate. Then the ocean claimed it without hesitation. Water poured into the cockpit, cold and heavy, rising fast around Dixon's legs. The Devastator was sinking straight down, dragged by its own weight as if a plug had been pulled from the sea. Dixon moved first. He had practiced emergency procedures countless times, but none of them covered this moment exactly. He unbuckled, climbed onto the wing, and reached for the life raft package as the aircraft tilted sharply to one side. The wing dipped, the angle increased, the ocean rushed up to meet him. He pulled the inflation cord. Nothing happened. He pulled again. Still nothing. Behind him, Aldrich and Pastula scrambled out of their positions, fighting against the pull of the sinking aircraft. They had seconds, no more. The tail of the bomber lifted into the air, pointing skyward, then slipped beneath the surface. The Devastator vanished as if it had never existed, leaving only ripples and a widening ring of disturbed water. Everything they had depended on was gone with it. The emergency radio, signal flares, food, water, navigation tools. In less than half a minute, their entire margin for survival had disappeared into the depths. Dixon was now chest-deep in the Pacific, holding an uninflated raft package and struggling to stay afloat. The water was shockingly cold despite the tropical latitude, stealing breath and strength with every second. Aldrich and Pastula surfaced nearby, clinging to their life jackets, eyes wide as they searched for anything solid. Dixon found the CO2 cartridge and forced the mechanism again. This time it worked. The raft inflated violently, but upside down. What followed was a battle measured not in distance or time, but in raw exhaustion. The overturned raft was slick and uncooperative, slamming into them with every passing swell. Each attempt to flip it was undone by another wave. Their arms burned. Their lungs ached. The sun dropped lower in the sky. Dixon knew darkness would change everything. Night would bring colder temperatures, larger swells, and no visibility. If they didn't get inside the raft before then, they would not survive the night. Pastula had an idea born of desperation. He tore off his shirt and tied it to the rope running along the raft's edge. Aldrich did the same. They used the makeshift line to create leverage, swimming to opposite sides and pulling with everything they had left. The raft resisted once more, then rolled. It landed right side up, with a heavy slap against the water. One by one, the men dragged themselves over the sides and collapsed inside. For a long moment, no one spoke. They lay there gasping, listening to the sound of their own breathing and the endless movement of the sea around them. They were alive. But as Dixon finally sat up and looked around, the reality of their situation settled in. They were alone in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, floating in a rubber raft smaller than a mattress, with no food, no water, no radio, and no clear direction. The sun dipped toward the horizon. The first night was coming. Darkness arrived without ceremony. The sun slipped below the horizon, and with it went the last sense of scale and direction. The Pacific became an endless black surface, broken only by moonlight and the pale foam of passing swells. The raft rose and fell like a cork, every impact echoing through the thin rubber floor. There was no position in which three men could rest. Someone's legs were always tangled with someone else's. The raft offered no cushioning, no warmth, and no protection from the water that sloshed over the sides with every larger wave. Their clothes were soaked through within minutes, and the night air cooled them faster than the sun had burned them. No one slept. Each attempt ended when another wave slammed the bottom of the raft, sending a jolt through their bodies like a blow from below. Dixon kept time in his head, counting the seconds between swells, forcing his mind to stay active. Panic was a luxury they could not afford. Morning brought light, but no comfort. The ocean stretched in every direction, unchanged. During the night, the raft had drifted, though how far was impossible to know. The men were exhausted, chilled, and already dehydrated. Salt crusted their skin. Aldrich's lips had begun to crack, and Pastula's face was reddened from the previous day's sun. Dixon took inventory. The list was short and brutal. A pocket knife, a small whistle, a service pistol with limited ammunition, a pair of pliers, rubber cement meant for patching the raft, 2 life jackets, nothing else, no water, no food, no compass, no radio. The sun climbed quickly, and the raft transformed into a floating furnace. Heat reflected upward from the rubber floor, trapping the air inside. By midday, the temperature was unbearable. The men stripped down to reduce heat retention, but exposure only invited worse burns. Skin blistered within hours. Late in the morning, they heard it. Aircraft engines. All three looked up at once. A Navy plane passed at a distance, flying a search pattern. Dixon stood, waving both arms. Pastula blew the whistle until his lungs burned. Aldrich tore off his undershirt and waved it wildly. The aircraft continued on its course and vanished. From altitude, the yellow raft was nothing. Just another shape among waves and reflections. Dixon understood then what he hadn't allowed himself to consider before. Even if search planes passed directly overhead, the odds of being seen were almost non-existent. By afternoon, thirst became the enemy. Their mouths were dry, tongues thick and swollen. Swallowing hurt. The salt water they had taken in during the ditching only made it worse. Dixon knew the limits of the human body. Without water, days, not weeks, were all they had. As the sun began to lower again, Dixon faced another decision. Winds in this part of the Pacific usually blew from east to west. If they drifted passively, they would eventually reach islands, but those islands were likely enemy-held. The alternative was to try pushing south and east toward territory that might still be friendly. They had no oars, no sail. Dixon removed his shoes and demonstrated how to use them as crude paddles. Leaning over the side, they pulled water toward themselves, creating the smallest hint of forward motion. After an hour of effort, their arms were burning and their progress measured in yards. Night fell again. The second night was worse than the first. Hunger joined thirst. Sleep remained impossible. The ocean did not rest, and neither could they. Somewhere beneath them, the Pacific waited. The third day adrift erased any remaining sense of normal time. Morning and night blended into cycles of heat and cold, exhaustion and brief alertness. The raft drifted without intention, carried by forces the men could not see or control. Dixon watched the sky constantly, measuring the sun's path, searching clouds for any sign of rain. By midday, the heat was punishing. The rubber floor trapped warmth like an oven, and the air inside the raft felt thick and unmoving. Sweat stopped forming altogether. That frightened Dixon more than anything else. It meant dehydration was tightening its grip. Then, in the distance, dark clouds rose above the horizon. A storm was coming. Storms in the open ocean were dangerous. Strong winds could flip the raft, waves could tear it apart. But storms also carried the one thing the men needed more than anything else: fresh water. Dixon made the call immediately. They would take the risk. When the rain arrived, it fell in sheets so dense the world seemed to dissolve. The men opened their mouths and drank straight from the sky. Water ran down their faces and into their throats. It was cold, clean, and overwhelming. They drank until their stomachs cramped, until they could barely breathe. The storm passed quickly, as storms often do in the tropics. The rain stopped, the clouds broke apart, the ocean returned to its rolling indifference. The storm had saved them, but it had also carried the raft far from any place where search planes might still be looking. Not long after, movement appeared beneath the surface. Small shapes darted just below the raft, flashing silver in the sunlight. Fish, curious, unafraid, swimming close enough to touch. Hunger sharpened their focus. Aldrich leaned over the side, reaching again and again, but the fish were too quick. Weakness had slowed his reactions. Finally, he drew his pocket knife and waited, blade submerged, hand trembling. When a fish passed close enough, he struck. The blade connected. The fish thrashed violently, scattering the others. Aldrich hauled it into the raft before it could escape. Dixon used the pliers to end it quickly, then cut away what meat they could. There was no fire, no seasoning. They ate it raw, dividing every piece evenly. It was not much, only a few ounces each, but it changed everything. The taste was rich and life-giving. Food meant energy. Energy meant hope. But the ocean never gives without taking something in return. That night, shadows began to circle beneath the raft. Slow, heavy, deliberate. Dixon felt a dull thump against the rubber floor. Then another. Sharks. They did not attack. They tested. Each bump sent a tremor through the raft and through Dixon's mind. If the animals decided the raft was prey, there would be no defense. The men pulled their limbs inward and waited. No one spoke. The darkness felt thicker now, closer. By morning, the sharks were gone, but the message remained. The ocean was not a passive backdrop. It was an active force, watching, responding, pushing back. The men had crossed an invisible line. Survival was no longer about waiting. It was about adapting, or being consumed. By the sixth day, survival itself began to change shape. Food and water were no longer the only concerns. The human body, pushed past its limits, started demanding payment for every extra hour of life. The shark meat had given them strength, but it came with a price. The dense, oily flesh left their mouths even drier than before. Their bodies needed water to process it, and there was none. Dixon watched the signs closely. Urine grew darker, then scarce. Aldrich stopped producing it altogether. That frightened Dixon more than hunger ever could. It meant the kidneys were beginning to fail. They waited for rain that did not come. With no other option left, Dixon made a decision he had hoped to avoid. He explained it calmly, without drama. Drinking seawater would kill them faster. But urine, unpleasant as it was, could slow dehydration for a short time. It would not save them, but it might buy another day. Dixon went first, forcing himself to swallow the warm, bitter liquid. Aldrich and Pastula followed. No one spoke afterward. Dignity had become irrelevant. The sun continued its assault. Their skin blistered and peeled. Burns cracked open and oozed where salt water never allowed healing. At night, pain replaced fear. Lying down was impossible. Any pressure reopened wounds. Sleep came only in fragments measured in seconds. By the end of the week, their minds began to betray them. Dixon saw shapes on the horizon that vanished when he focused. Aldrich whispered about land. Green hills, trees, beaches that existed only in his imagination. Pastula heard voices calling from the water, familiar and comforting, urging him to lean closer. They learned not to challenge the hallucinations. Arguing wasted energy. Instead, they acknowledged them quietly and waited for them to fade. Another bird appeared, circling low. It landed on the raft without fear, folding its wings as if exhausted. The pistol came up. One shot echoed across the empty sea. The bird fell instantly. They ate everything: meat, organs, even parts they would never have considered under normal circumstances. Protein meant strength. Strength meant time. Blood from the bird spread across the water. The sharks returned. This time, they were more aggressive. One struck the raft hard enough to lift the floor beneath Dixon's knees. Aldrich tied a cord around his wrist again, knife ready, eyes hollow but focused. When the shark came close, he struck for the gills. The animal thrashed violently, nearly pulling him overboard. Dixon and Pastula dragged him back with what little strength they had left. Another shark followed. This one did not escape. They hauled it into the raft, where it fought until it was finally still. The shark became food, and its liver, rich and bitter, became medicine of a kind. They had heard stories of its nutrients. They ate it first. As night fell, Dixon understood something essential. The ocean was not choosing to spare them. It was testing them. Each day was an exchange: pain for calories, fear for water, blood for time. And the price was rising. By the second week adrift, the men no longer resembled sailors or airmen. They were reduced to systems struggling to stay online. Muscle wasted away rapidly, stripped to fuel organs that refused to shut down. Ribs became visible. Faces collapsed inward. Strength vanished in uneven waves, sometimes returning briefly, sometimes gone for hours at a time. Saltwater sores opened across their hands and feet, raw wounds that never healed. Every time they reached into the ocean to bail water or catch fish, the salt burned like acid. Aldrich's hands swelled and stiffened until he could barely grip the knife. Pastula's foot became infected, swollen, and hot to the touch. Walking was impossible. There was nowhere to walk anyway. Sleep deprivation became its own weapon. The raft was too small for 3 men to lie down at once. Waves struck the bottom relentlessly, jolting them awake whenever consciousness threatened to take hold. Dixon estimated he had slept no more than a few hours in total since ditching. His thoughts slowed. Decisions took longer. Concentration fractured. The mind followed the body into decline. Hallucinations became frequent and vivid. Aldrich saw coastlines and palm trees several times a day. Pastula spoke to people who were not there, reliving meals from his past in exact detail. Dixon saw his wife standing on the raft one night, clear and solid, before she faded into darkness. None of them reacted anymore. They had learned that acknowledging the visions without acting on them was the only way through. The raft itself began to fail. Constant flexing weakened the rubber. Small leaks appeared, barely visible but terrifying. They patched them carefully with the remaining cement, knowing there would be no second chance if a major tear opened. Birds became their markers now. One bird meant nothing. Several birds flying low meant food. Birds diving repeatedly meant shallow water somewhere nearby. Dixon watched them constantly, measuring hope against reason. Another storm arrived late in the afternoon, stronger than the last. Winds howled across the open water. Waves lifted the raft high, then slammed it down into troughs hard enough to knock the breath from their lungs. They tied themselves to the raft with cords made from their remaining clothes. If it flipped, separation would mean death. Rain returned violently. They drank until their stomachs hurt, then drank more. Fresh water burned going down, shocking their systems awake. The storm lasted less than an hour, but it left them barely conscious, trembling and alive. As night fell, Dixon noticed something subtle but important. The wind had shifted, not dramatically, just enough to feel different on his skin. Instead of pushing them steadily west, it now came from the north. Dixon said nothing. Hope, given too early, could be more dangerous than despair. But for the first time in days, he watched the horizon with a new intensity. The ocean had not finished with them yet. By the 3rd week, the raft had become their entire universe. The idea of solid ground felt unreal, like a memory borrowed from someone else's life. Dixon could barely remember the sound of boots on a deck or the smell of fuel and metal. The raft, the waves, the sky. This was all that existed now. Aldrich grew quiet. He stopped reacting to pain, stopped speaking unless spoken to. Infection spread up his arms in angry red lines, and his breathing became shallow and uneven. Pastula was little better. His leg was badly swollen, useless, and his body shook constantly from weakness and fever. Dixon knew the signs. Without intervention, they were running out of time. Then the patterns changed. Birds appeared more often now, not circling high, but flying low and diving into the water. The color of the sea shifted from deep blue to a lighter green. Dixon noticed the waves behaving differently, breaking at odd angles, colliding instead of rolling cleanly. These were not hallucinations. These were signs. Land was close. Dixon did not announce it. The others were too far gone to understand, and false hope could break what little resolve remained. Instead, he focused on keeping the raft oriented, using scraps of cloth as a crude drag to slow their drift. One afternoon, Aldrich spoke for the first time in days. His voice was barely a whisper. He said he saw green. Dixon lifted his head and looked. At first, there was nothing. Then, as the raft rose on a swell, he saw it too. A thin, unmistakable line on the horizon. Palm trees. Real ones, not imagined. The raft was drifting past the island, carried sideways by current and wind. Missing it would mean death. Dixon improvised immediately, creating as much resistance as he could with torn fabric and his own body weight. The raft slowed, just enough. The reef appeared suddenly, white water breaking against jagged coral. The raft struck hard, tearing open, filling with water. The men were thrown forward, carried over the reef by the force of the waves, and into the calmer lagoon beyond. Dixon's feet touched sand. He stood, then collapsed. He dragged Aldrich toward shore, step by step, falling again and again. Pastula crawled beside them, moving only through stubborn refusal to stop. The beach was close, then closer, then beneath them. Dixon collapsed on the sand and lost consciousness. When he woke, there were voices around him. Hands lifted him gently. Fresh water touched his lips. This was no dream. Islanders had seen the raft and come to help. The men had reached land after more than a month at sea. They had drifted over 1,000 miles in 34 days. Survived on rain, raw fish, birds, sharks, and sheer will. Every system in their bodies was failing, but they were alive. Rescue came days later. The raft was recovered and preserved, a silent witness to what 3 men endured when the Pacific tried to erase them. They had refused, and the ocean at last had let them go.